So, hi, this is Nick, Pennsylvania. I am here with Brendan Bond. As always, I'm just going to dive right into this. Most recently, we came out and we talked about the Y Cemetery. And again, we're calling it the Y Cemetery for a couple reasons. Primarily because this is a place that has been vandalized. And I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit momentarily. But the Y Cemetery definitely looms large. If you didn't listen to that, please maybe give a listen to that first, because we're kind of returning to that in a way. Here's what I mean. I actually ran into a couple people, both of whom had additional things they wanted to say about it. One was at a gas station in Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, in Butler County, and another was with a person I kind of know semi-professionally up in Mercer, county seat of Mercer County, Pennsylvania. So here's one of the things they both said to me, and this is another really large aspect of the legends that surround the Y Cemetery. Now, Brendan, I don't know if you've heard this aspect, but there was a couple things we didn't talk about. One, a common thing that was brought to me by the lady I spoke with in Mercer County, who's a big hunter, which is kind of why maybe this is a bigger thing for her, is that's often cited that people will hear dogs, and they say it is the hunting hounds of the family patriarch, because he was a known trapper in the region in the late 18th century. That's how he acquired the land, which the cemetery still sits on today. But yeah, there's oftentimes cited the sounds of dogs, and they are said to be the ghosts of the family patriarch's hunting hounds. Have you heard that story associated with the cemetery ever?
Yeah, I've heard that the sounds people hear, especially like chasing people out and everything, are specifically dogs. Now, I've heard two stories around the dogs. One, the one that you just mentioned, that they are the ghost hounds of the patriarch, which, that kind of makes sense because, I'm sure those dogs were also pulling double duty as guard dogs at the time. So the idea of them chasing people out or just being having a high prey drive, I imagine, carries over into death with dogs like that.
Well, in the time this family was establishing themselves out here in Western Pennsylvania, too, this was still an area prone to violence and skirmishes between the indigenous tribes and the European people who were moving into the region. Of course, I'm sure you're somewhat familiar, and I get the details of this kind of mixed up periodically. But the Moravians, and there was a massacre of, I believe it was Lenape or Mingo people in a Moravian church where British troops set fire to the church. That wasn't but 40 minutes, I believe, from where I'm at right now. So again, at the time that the family was establishing, you mentioned guard dogs. That's an interesting aspect that I hadn't thought about. But again, this was still a pretty rough and tumble place at that period. We're talking early 19th century, early 1800s.
Yeah, specifically, I'm not sure if you've ever read the book. What's it called? It's called just like Camping or Campcraft or Woodcraft by Nessmuck. I'll make sure you get a copy of the book. I know I have it back here somewhere. But he was a trapper especially along the northern tier up near Clarion, that area and everything. But I remember one of his books, he talked about keeping dogs in camps, in these trapping camps. And he said the great thing about it was when either native tribes or people that were coming in to, for one reason or another, whether it was good or bad, the dogs would let the folks in the camp know. The dogs would start barking and chase people out. But if you were trying to be stealthy and not be seen by other folks who are around, the dogs were a problem because they would bark. And that's something I always remember from that book, just thinking like, oh, this is kind of a weird duality. You're like, oh, great, the dogs are barking. Or like, oh God, the dogs are barking. Now everyone knows where we are, But yeah, so the dogs being the patriarch's dogs is definitely one part of it that I've heard. The other take on the whole ghost dog thing, I've heard before, I'm sure comes up in lots of other cemeteries or places like this. And that is the idea that these are actually hellhounds that have been summoned by some nefarious party to either protect the cemetery or to terrorize people around the cemetery or things of that nature.
Well, it's funny that you bring that up only because the only times I had ever heard of hellhounds are old folk songs predominantly. And of course, I have enough of that laying around me. But I didn't ever hear hellhounds brought into the folklore of the northern Appalachians until real recently when I was actually reading a story, an account of a woman who had been visiting Moundsville Prison, of course, which is just west of us in Ohio, the state of Ohio. And she claims to have photographed, just by happenstance, a hellhound in one of the old cells, and then it followed her home and it talked all about that. It was an interesting story, but I want to say two quick things. One being that I had totally forgotten about the dog angle of this, but I remember taking a friend out to see the cemetery. It was the same day. It was early spring, and the road doesn't have any winter maintenance, so it's not easily passable. It's certainly not by the sedans that I'm most often driving in the winter months. But so this was early mid-spring, so it's still cool. It's still getting dark fairly early. It's still very wet back there because it rains a lot over here. The day I found that cluster gauge by that hollowed log area that I thought was just like a sluice or something, we had heard dogs howling most of the time, and I didn't think much of it until I thought, like, oh, we're a little ways, like I shouldn't be able to hear them from somebody's house. And of course, that thought came only after I had been told about, well, there's the stories of the dog. So I think that might be a little me making those pieces fit after the fact. But since you brought up that book, I'm sure you're familiar with Philip Tome in his, I believe it was called 30 Years or 40 Years a Hunter.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Now, Philip Tome, he was up north more yet. He was in what's now Warren County, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. But he was one of the early European settlers and a hunter, a sustenance hunter. And his book, though, you really take with a grain of salt because his is one of the earlier accounts we have of hoop snakes. Snakes that will bite their tail, roll down the hill, and supposedly will strike things with their tail and turn them into stone or paralyze them. And so, again, very fun read, Philip Tome. I've been to his grave, in fact. He is buried right next to the corn planter monument. But is it reliable history? Probably not.
I mean, as much as I love hoop snakes. But yeah, anytime you have someone speaking about hoop snakes, this is myself included, maybe take what they're saying with a grain of salt. Exactly. if they're recounting those kind of tales. But one other thing, with going back to the dog element real quick with the cemetery, something I'm not a scholar on, so someone else out there might be able to help us on this. Have we talked about the element of church grims when it comes to this cemetery?
Grims.
So a church grim isn't, I believe it's an English or a Nordic, or maybe both, tradition.
Possibly both. I mean, the hymns, basically anywhere in the UK that ends with BY, like Hemsby, was, from what I understand, was a Scandinavian settlement, from all the Vikings and whatnot.
So church grims, what church grims are is they're basically these large spectral black dogs that would protect churches and I believe graveyards as well. I'm not sure if it's like just graveyards attached to churches or if it's also just freestanding graveyards. I believe it started with, they would actually bury a dog. I don't know if it's under the cornerstone maybe or something like that. Again, I'm not an expert on it, but I know there is like a history of these spectral dogs, keeping away specifically like evil spirits, demons, things like that. Anybody that, or even grave robbers, thieves, things like that, which were obviously a much larger real concern a few hundred years ago in England with grave robbing and things like that. But I wonder if there's any if the dog stuff we have here has any relation to that. Like
Well, I have to admit that.
maybe it's a good spirit that's like protecting the place.
Well, and again, I think it depends on what side of that you're on. Whether you're, if you are in this family who this is the family plot, anything that's chasing people away from that family plot is probably to be seen as a good thing, especially since, like we've talked about and alluded to, there's been a bit of vandalism over there. In fact, the other person I was talking to over in Slippery Rock just kind of entered a conversation, kind of somewhat accidentally, and we were talking about it, and they said, they have shown some people where it's at, because it can be a little difficult to get to if you're not intimately familiar with the region. I talked about my difficulties in finding it early on, and I'm someone who's very familiar with the area. That said, she basically said that kids go out there and it's more than just kids going out there to kind of scare each other. I mean, people have broken parts of it, knocked things down, and some investment has been made to correct that in recent years. Not only physically repairing some of the things and putting up a more modern marker, kind of denoting where you're at and who's buried within. By the way, I don't know if you're aware, the most recent burial in that cemetery, I think, was 1894, 1895. So it's pretty old. The oldest person in there was born in 1733.
Yeah, I remember that was one of the big things whenever I heard about it the first time, hearing how old even the newest burial was in that plot.
The other way in which that's some rectification has come about is apparently park staff, because this is in or abuts a state park, patrol that area in the evenings now periodically against kids hanging out there, which they definitely weren't when I was first going back that way.
Yeah, that's definitely a new policy, but I'm glad to hear it.
So if you're not being chased out by phantom dogs, or our friend's experience where something was running after them, which could also be phantom dogs, you might be getting chased out by some sort of a authority of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
In a spectral Chevy S10.
Or it could be the red eyes. Now, you've heard of the red eyes, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah.
Now, we failed. I don't believe we talked about the red eyes at all the last time we were together on this subject, and this person brought that fact up and said, well, I can't believe you didn't, because half the people I ever hear about, that's all they talk about with relation to the place. And I asked her, well, you've been there a lot. You just talked about showing people that you can trust the site and everything. Have you ever seen the red eyes? And she said, no. Neither had anybody that she'd taken back there.
No, that's why I was kind of laughing when you said about the red eyes, because I had two people that listened to the last episode mention the red eyes as well. And like, you're right, we should have done our due diligence and covered everything, but for that exact same reason. It's one of those things where you hear people talk about the red eyes, but I don't even know anybody who has seen them, or has like a older brother or a third cousin, or went to school with a dude that has seen them. So like, but they're absolutely attached to the lore of that cemetery, and I have no idea where the red eyes things comes. Like, I don't know what that comes from.
Well, I had a few thoughts, and I mean, of course, I've talked and read about what people think. Some people think the red eyes are associated with the dogs, of course, because everything else is associated with either the dogs or the patriarch of the family, which, of course, some people say the red eyes are his. But I do know that we've come across other stories, particularly ones that take place in woods, where red eyes or a red light seems to follow people.
You see red eyes come up a lot of places, and I feel like it comes up most often with other places that have ghost lights associated with them. I feel like some lore uses red eyes almost as a stand-in for what we would call ghost lights or will-o-wisps, things of that nature. So it's almost like this, like anytime you have a place that's supposed to have paranormal activity of whatever kind, you can literally just throw a dart at the dartboard. Whatever you hit, there's going to be auditory stuff, there's going to be something light related, and there's usually going to be some sort of a element that either beckons people or chases them out. And I think that's the big difference between what we would traditionally call ghost lights and what we would call like red eyes, because usually the ghost lights lead people deeper into things, and then if it's something chasing you out, it's very rarely a light chasing you out. People usually say, oh, there was red eyes. They don't say if they're 5 feet wide or if they are the size of normal human eyes or dog eyes or something like that. And I think it's interesting that you always have one of those two elements.
Well, and that's one of the things I was thinking about too, and I'm happy that you said like there's not a lot of description of how far apart these eyes are set, because I automatically think too, well, we know there's a lot of nocturnal wildlife in the area, from the common white-tailed deer that's often out at night, to raccoons and possums and cats, and of course I believe our wildlife department has come out and confirmed that we have wild big cats again.
We do. Yep.
And I know that you saw one in your backyard before the state announced, because, of course, they were concerned that, well, if we announce early, at least this is how I interpret it, if we announce early, people are going to be harassing or going after these animals or reacting badly. But I know when you see a deer or a possum's eyes at night, it's a greenish yellow color. I don't know if most nocturnal animals that are known for sight, night vision, you can see that glow in their eye. And I'm not going to accurately describe the biology of an eye, but I mean, look at your house cat or look at your dog at night, and you see that because it's taking in as much light as it can.
Yeah. So what that is called, and the reason I know about this is from listening to way too many Bigfoot podcasts talking about eye shine and eye glow and things like that. So what you're talking about there, Nick, is called a tapetum lucidum. That is the element that
I'm so happy you're here tonight just to say this.
I know, just say tapetum lucidum.
Sounds delicious.
But humans do not have them. And a majority of there's a lot of animals that do, some don't. I do not believe there are any great apes that have a tapetum lucidum, but there are some New World monkeys that do, maybe. Basically it has to deal with night vision, and it has to deal with how the eye is set up to collect low light. Now, as far as the color of the shine, it apparently, from what, again, not a biologist, but from what I understand, it has actually a lot to do with the diet of the animal. And the reason that has been shown, or at least I've heard of that, is people have talked about it in bears, how depending on a bear's diet, it can go from yellow to green to even blue with this reflective.
Now, that would be something to see, because yellows and greens all day long,
but blue
or red even. I don't know of an animal where you say red.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's, I think, where a lot of what, as soon as you say red eye shine or eye glow, which I think we have to say there is a difference. Eye shine, like we're talking about with this tapetum lucidum, is a reflecting of visible light, like light's coming into the animal's eye and being reflected back at a certain color. I don't believe there's anything that has a red tapetum lucidum, but it's a big world out there, so it's very possible something does. Now, when people talk about a lot
real
of
quick, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I will say I was thinking about it, and I do think that I've seen it in rabbits with a reddish.
That's possible.
Glow.
Yeah, no. I'll walk that back and say that I'm not familiar with it, but it's very possible that red tapetum lucidums are absolutely a thing. But now eye glow is something completely different. If we're talking about it from a biological standpoint, I don't know of any animal that has like bioluminescent eyes. Like maybe there's some fish that do. I can't think of anything else that has glowing eyes.
Well, and we're certainly not being chased out of this, and well, not you or me or
Mhm.
this lady in Slippery Rock are being chased out by fish, but
I wish I had that problem. I
it
wish,
would be an interesting one.
yeah, as a fisherman, if there was large red-eyed fish chasing me, it's a problem I'm okay with.
But I was thinking about a few things. Obviously, I was thinking about dogs and how often ghost dogs in particular. In fact, more than any other animal I can think of, it's dogs that we hear of. And I think part of that is because, I mean, what do dogs represent in that story you talked about with the traditional cemeteries and everything? They are a companion, they are a guardian, and I think we tend to personify them a lot with human
Absolutely.
elements. And so I think our folk tales reflect that. Maybe cats after that, I'm not sure, but dogs, there's so many stories of ghost dogs, and most of our other legends we've talked about, like I told that story of the white thing in West Virginia early on,
Yeah.
and you brought up Bigfoot already. And of course, the red eyes, there's some people in this region that say those red eyes are, there's Bigfoot sightings in this region too, which that's a far cry for me. But yeah,
Yeah.
whatever. We'll have Brian on again, and you and Brian can talk about that. but that too, Bigfoot is always described as a hominid. I think a lot of times we are looking for ourselves in these things, and that's why I laugh about the idea of fish or rabbits for so many reasons.
Yeah, because we don't see them as natural guardians or allies. We see them as, part of nature. Whereas dogs are one of those few animals that has been domesticated to the point that I think you're right. I think in our kind of collective unconsciousness or in our history, we're so used to dogs being the bridge over that gap between our family and our home and who we are and the wild, almost. Because like when we see a dog, we think, oh, this is different than a wolf, you know where biologically, they're so close, but you would never look at a dog and think, oh, this is a wild. Even the most unruly dog is not a wild animal. It's still a dog, you know and
I know what you're
yeah,
getting at.
yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that because of that, I think you're right. Whenever we talk about the co-creative element of folklore and all this paranormal stuff all the time, I think you're right when you say we we want to use things that we're familiar with that at least make some sort of sense to us when we're trying to understand these phenomena or these stories. Where just earlier, like you said, if you're saying this to this lady, oh, there's ghost dogs, that chase people out. You go, okay, that fits the narrative of a place being spectrally protected. If she said, oh, this place used to raise chickens and ghost chickens will chase you out, you'd immediately be like, I'm not sure about that. That sounds ghost dogs
Well,
I'm okay with, but ghost chickens,
it's
like
almost
now I'm
like
questioning it.
you have to have such a degree of familiarity in order to be scared. And what I mean by that is just like, I am not a dog person. You know that about me. I'm fine with dogs. I don't want to live with dogs. We're just incompatible personality wise. I'm much more of a cat person. I'm probably half cat for all you know. There's the familiarity, though, that even a person like me is going to have. Whereas, let me put it this way, if you had a ghost owl in your backyard, how would you tell the difference between it and a real owl unless you just saw it disappear? And I think that's why the legend, like owls are
Uh,
practically ghosts already. They're
yeah, they're
silent. They
yeah,
all of a sudden spook you out and fly. Like I had one fly over my car one night a couple years ago, and it was so
yeah.
massive and silent that it's no mystery to me why these are so widely worshipped.
Exactly. Now, I think you're getting to something there with talking about the difference between, like, like cats, dogs, and our familiarity and things like that. I think when it comes to the storytelling element of this, and this might be a cultural thing or it might be an innate human thing, I'm not sure which. I'm going to go with the former. This is more of a cultural thing. As both of us have done a decent amount of storytelling and story writing in our pasts and currently, and we know one element of storytelling is the suspension of disbelief. And typically, whenever you are telling a story, adding in one layer of that suspension, people buy without a whole lot of explanation, whether that is ghosts, whether it's zombies, whether it's time travel, whether it's vampires, whether it's sci-fi. People don't kind of think twice about it. It doesn't really raise any red flags. They go, okay, this is what we're doing. Cool. Keep on going with the story. Whenever you add multiple layers, though, you're more likely for people to go, you know what, this is it. It reminds them too often how different it is from their normal reality. Whenever you have vampires, people go, okay, cool, vampires. Whenever you have time traveling space vampires, people get too caught up on that, on those three tiers.
This is really funny because it makes me think of Star Wars, and as you know, I'm aware of the original trilogy. I watched that, but I never watched anything beyond that because it wasn't my cup of coffee. It's fine. I'm not into it. I know you're big into it in a way that I am not, but I remember specifically there was a lot said about Jar Jar Binks, and all these people were upset with him because they're like, oh, it's this clownish thing, and why does it speak with the Jamaican accent? Like that was too far for you. It's not weird that all they're all aliens and they all sound like Americans or English people, and that wasn't too far. But the Jamaican accent's too much.
Yeah, and no, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. Is you have those different suspensions of disbelief that we ask our audiences to accept, and it's very often irrational when you hit that one that you're just like, you know what, I can't, like, now I can't deal with it. Whenever we're telling these stories, these ghost stories and everything, that's why I think so often they follow these patterns that we keep talking about. There's auditory stuff, there's light phenomena, there's weird feelings, things like that. And then when we say, oh well, something is chasing people out, what is it? Okay, well, dogs, because that fits the narrative of a place being protected, because that's only one layer of this disbelief, this suspension of disbelief. Because if you went to a normal house that was not spectral in any way and you were trespassing, you would get chased out by a dog, very likely.
First thing I thought of was breaking into a junkyard.
Exactly right, yeah. Which we've all done how many times?
And I did once. Yeah, I had. That's a whole. I was story. Not chased by a dog. I knew the owners a bit different, but I did have to jump a fence.
But you understand where I'm going with this, though, that it's
no, I absolutely understand where you're going with this, and I agree. And I go back to, I think the important factor there is that we have, with dogs, probably more than anything else, animal wise, with dogs, we have such a symbiotic relationship that we still see dogs as an animal, but it's like you said, even a dog that's real ornery is still a dog and not a coyote and not a wolf, which we can still we are able to differentiate a thing that really, when you break it down, isn't very different.
Exactly. And that's why I think you don't see stories like this very often, where a monster of some sort is chasing people out. Something else along those lines.
That monster being Bigfoot, yes, but I get what you're saying, like a monstrous animal.
True. No, so yeah, when it comes to these dogs and everything, we see them showing up all over folklore. A lot of it English folklore, which again kind of makes sense for the cemetery we're talking about in particular, but also just this area in general. If you just do like a real quick search on Google for black dogs and folklore, there's a lot that comes up, obviously. And they're all over the place as far as what they do and where they come from and whatnot. Seems like a lot of them are like fae based, I would say. and they're often like protectors, but you get just as many that are, malevolent hellhound type things, which is funny. I don't know where the whole hellhound thing comes from. Do you know offhand?
I mean, I've heard different things about it. Like in the old folk records, especially like blues records, like
Mm-hmm.
most most people that have a cursory understanding of blues are familiar with the name Robert Johnson, and if they're more familiar than with just the name, they might be familiar with Hellhound on My Trail. But there's a couple other songs which he mentions the Hellhound in, and of course he was a late comer compared to players such as like Charlie Patton. And I'm thinking about some Charlie because I'm much more Charlie Patton was much more interesting to me than Robert Johnson. I think Robert Johnson just got better press by people in the 60s. That said, I can't think of a reference that he makes of them, but it has been suggested in some of the writing around those records that this has to relate with like the African trickster god and whatnot.
Oh.
Because just as often, they have references to the devil, and sometimes it's clearly very Christian devil, and sometimes it's like an impish sort of figure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Oh,
I've
that's
heard
interesting.
those definitions. I've also heard, I spoke about reading that account of the woman in Ohio, and that came with some, well, what are hellhounds, and the discussion in that. It was brought up that some places where terrible things happen, they're tied to like a demonic thing, which again, okay, why? But I think this too is a very human thing in the sense that a dog is just a dog. It's just a nature thing. It's an instinctive thing.
Mm-hmm.
A wolf is just, or an animal is a whale is just a whale. We don't usually look at a whale as an example and say
Mm-hmm.
it's doing something evil or it's doing something benevolent.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when you talk about the hellhound as being this benevolent thing, and also these dog spirit things being guardian things, I think that is giving an agency to them that we usually reserve for ourselves.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And it does go along with the personification that we do a lot. Now that I'm like thinking more about the whole like hellhound thing, I think you're right that they're usually guardians of places where things have gone bad. I can only assume that goes back to like Cerberus guarding Hades or hell or whatever, them being like protectors and things like that. Because you think about it, whenever ancient man was sleeping around, the campfire, that's what they did for us. They were the ones on watch. So yeah, I think that's a natural thing that we do, is adding that personification, because in that either benevolence or malevolence, based on that, almost makes more sense to us, I think, naturally, because I don't think humans like thinking about things as not, well, we don't want to get into a whole discussion on whether or not morality is a priori or a posteriori, but uh, but I think I agree with you that I think it's a natural thing people do.
Yeah, funny thing, just to wrap up our conversation for the evening, I was speaking to my wife actually, who grew up around you, and she grew up in a little neighborhood, kind of, a little rougher neighborhood, and she talked about there was a ghost dog. And I remember talking to her about this when
Really?
we were like 20. Yeah. And you know the neighborhood she grew up in.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know if you had any story about it or had heard. But
No, but I'm fascinated.
when we were talking, it brought up some memory that she had, but then she's like, I don't know if you put that into my head. And I said, no, I did not, because I remember we had been talking years ago. We were driving to her parents' old place at the time. And I remember she had said something about having heard the story on the bus, but one day when she was driving home, a dog ran out right in front of her car, and she like slammed on the brakes, and there was no dog anywhere. And she got home, and that was her one encounter. And I said, do you remember anything more? Do you remember the stories from the school bus and everything? And she said, No, so I don't think it would be worth recording me telling you the story because that's really all I can
That's it.
recall. Other than to say that there were tales of there was a phantom dog that haunted the neighborhood.
That is awesome. I've never heard that. But I mean, I think you get a lot of little stories like that a lot of places. And, we've talked before about how the more mundane encounters with the other, to me, are much more believable and a lot more, I think, likely to be, again, a lot more commonplace than what people like to think. Because you hear if she heard those stories and everything and then had that encounter, that's probably all it was just, a ghost dog. There's nothing more to it. Just it happens to be a dog that's a ghost.
And at some point, she opened her eyes back up and drove the rest of the way home. The end.
Well, I'm glad she drove the rest of the way home with her eyes open.
I do want to know, like, when she stepped out of her car, did she run to the front door and get in the house, or did she walk normally?
I would have ran.
I would have run too.
I'd have run too because again, there's either two options. Either there is a super dog,
that's not good.
That's probably not good because if he's out at that late hour, he's probably up to no good. Probably getting into hen houses and stuff.
There's that, and also like Tim, with great power, great responsibility. I don't know how the economics of dog temptation, but I can't imagine it's as good as my own, which isn't very good.
Yeah. So yeah, that dog is probably not making great moral decisions at that hour.
How often do you look at a dog and just wonder, what are you doing with your life?
With the dog I live with, I wonder that all the time because he's a golden retriever. So he has these big.
Now, there's a dog that uses a lot of eyeliner.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Because he looks at you, you're like, are you thinking of, I can't tell if you're thinking of everything or nothing right now. Like it's one or the other.
So to wrap that up, yeah, apparently we missed a lot when we were talking about the Y cemetery. There are reports of ghost dogs being heard or chasing people out, and of red eyes. And some people, again, they tie those red eyes with the dog. Some people tie those red eyes with the family patriarch. So interesting. It's funny how I had gone so much of my life never hearing of this place, and then once I heard about it, it seemed that everybody had a story about it, and they that whole time before they were just withholding them from me.
Yep, that seems to be how it goes. Yep.
Well, all right, Brendan, we'll leave it at that, and we definitely have some interviews, some stories lined up. How can people get a hold of us?
Yeah, so if you have anything, if you have any comments, have any stories, just want to chat, you can reach out to us at the Ghost Furnace Podcast at gmail.com, or using the same moniker, you can find us on Facebook or Instagram.